So our last speaker for this session is Emerson Bowyer, who's a Searle Associate Curator of European Paintings and Sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago. And the title of his paper today is History in Relief. Please join me in welcoming Emerson Bowyer.
Thank you. And firstly, I'd like to say thanks, like many of the other speakers, to Amy and Robert and Melanie for organizing this wonderful event. And it's a great honor to be here to join in this celebration of Steve's scholarship and collection. On March 1st, 1833, a machine made its debut at the Paris Salon. According to the official catalogue, entry 2739, submitted by the inventor Achille Collat, consisted of prints from steel engravings imitating medals, bas-reliefs, and cameos. This relatively benign description from the exhibition catalogue failed to note that the images were products of a new mechanical technology. The metal engraving machine, as it became known, rendered startlingly detailed trompe-l'oeil engravings after medals and other relief surfaces, and apparently without human intervention. Although it is unknown which prints were shown, they must have been similar to, for example, an engraving after the reverse of a Renaissance portrait medal produced by the same machine. And you can see the engraving there on the right and an example of a cast on the left. At first glance, the printed image appears to float in space, detached from any anchoring surface and possessing a seemingly tangible three-dimensionality. Closer inspection reveals a series of parallel, unbroken, and horizontally directed lines that almost click together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle or prefabricated industrial parts. It bears none of the syntax typically associated with the medium. No idiosyncratic combinations of hatching and cross-hatching, lozenges and dots, nor is there any variation in the thickness of line. The overwhelming effect is one of precise, standardized production. For viewers, prints such as this must have appeared quite strange. The metal engraving machine was an overnight success. It was also, however, the cause of great controversy, which climaxed in an 1836 British parliamentary inquiry focused on the nebulous issue of visual distortion. Both the hearings and the heated discussion they provoked in the press addressed the very nature of truth in visual reproduction and historical representation, as well as the fraught relationship between art and industry. This paper sketches the contentious career of Collat's now forgotten technology in the years immediately preceding the introduction of photography. The metal engraving machine was comprised of two interconnected arms, a tracer and an etcher. And here you see an illustration of a competitor to Collat's technology, but it's essentially the same. For every movement of the tracer across a relief surface, such as a medal, and you see here, that's the medal up there, and that's the tracer, and then this is the etcher here. So for every movement of the tracer across a relief surface, a corresponding line was simultaneously incised on a printing plate by the etching arm. The degree of curvature of the line was proportionate to the level of relief encountered by the tracer at any given point on the medal. The tracer moved methodically from one side of the medal to the other, and the etcher inscribed a series of continuous lines. More deeply shadowed areas of the subsequent prints arose from the lines being grouped more closely together in that section of the image. The main foundation for Collat's machine was the pantograph, a copying device invented in 1603 by the Jesuit physicist and astronomer Christopher Scheiner. Pantographs enabled the accurate reproduction of any two-dimensional image, as well as its proportional enlargement and reduction via a parallelogram of interconnected and movable bars. The user traced the image with one mechanical arm, and, at the same time, a copy was inscribed by the other arm. Within the pantograph's material and conceptual structure, the human body is relegated to the mechanical task of tracing. It embodies an authorless or automatic notion of the copy. This is underlined in Diderot's Encyclopédie, where, in a section devoted to drawing, a pantograph is illustrated. The caption for the plate notes that the device is commonly known as the monkey. Since the Renaissance, apes had come to embody the idea of mindless mimicry, and during the 18th century, an entire genre of jingerie gained popularity, most notably in the works by Watteau, Chardin, and Huet. These typically satirical or playful images portrayed monkeys performing all manner of human activities. A favorite motif was the monkey painter, which was frequently deployed as a proxy for portraitists, whose slavish copying of nature supposedly abandoned the higher academic goal of artistic invention. The association of pantographs and apes continued well into the 19th century, as can be seen in this 1844 illustration by Grandville, where the pantograph depicted in the background is given the likeness of a monkey. And in the foreground of the image, a blindfolded monkey traces the outline of a drawing by Raphael, an action that is simultaneously copied by a line of diminishing monkeys that descend to infinity. The notion of the blind monkey is particularly apt for Collart's metal engraving machine, which operated entirely by touch. Rather than relying upon a user to see and trace along the outlines of an original two-dimensional image, the metal engraving machine groped, undirected by a human hand, across a relief surface. Unlike the traditional pantograph, it did not reproduce the outlines of a pre-existing representation. Instead, it mapped the topography of a raised and irregular surface, producing essentially a graph or a graphic record of its movement. The result was not only an apparently accurate copy of the pictorial content of the original object, such as a medal, but also the illusion of the object's three-dimensionality. Among the first to be seduced by Collart's technology was the painter Paul Delaroche. In late 1832, according to the American entrepreneur Vincent Nolte, the artist encountered one of the machine-made prints. It amazed Delaroche and myself, he recalled. We had to touch the paper and look at the back of it to convince ourselves that it was not embossed. The image, Nolte explained, possessed almost palpable relief. Unlike the long-established tradition of using diagrammatic line engravings to reproduce medals and coins, Collart's images seem to rise from the page, ready to be held, caressed, and possessed. And here you can see a plate from an earlier numismatic publication. Numismatic illustrations tended to be simple line work showing idealized medals that essentially stood in for types. Collart's prints, in their close replication of individual objects, were in a sense completely the exact opposite. Nolte and Delaroche, along with their business partner, Alexandre Lachevardier, the publisher of the Magasin Pittoresque, agreed to exploit Collart's invention by producing a series of volumes illustrating historical coins and medals. Called the Trésor de Numismatique et de Glyptique, it would reproduce objects from public and private collections throughout Europe. Work on the Trésor began in mid-1833. Louis-Pierre Henriquel Dupont, a rising star of the print world, was engaged to supervise the production of the engravings. In addition, Charles Lenormand, a curator at the Cabinet de Médailles, agreed to furnish text to accompany each engraving. The Trésor commenced publication on May 3, 1834. It continued in weekly supplements available every Saturday, with its seriality echoing that of the numismatic objects themselves. Critical approbation was immediate, and the Journal des Artistes exclaimed that everyone is currently talking about the engravings of medals and other reliefs by the process of Monsieur Collard, where relief is imitated in such a way as to deceive even the most attentive eye. And for another critic, quote, the process used by the editors gives their reproductions the character of mathematical authenticity. Never has the Buren, led by even the most skillful hand, achieved such rigorous literalness. In addition to the serial volumes, other standalone books were produced, including one collecting the portrait medals of the contemporary sculptor David d'Angers. In the meantime, Collard had submitted his prints for the scrutiny of the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry. In April of 1834, its committee reported its findings and recommended the award of a silver medal. Writing for the committee, the inventor Amédée Durand announced the existence of a new art. In a description that seems to presage statements concerning the daguerreotype in 1839, Durand celebrates the ability of Collard's machine to, quote, replace with an immense superiority the use of the hand and eye in operations that require from those organs the greatest delicacy. The machine, concluded the committee, was incontestably superior to the hand of the artist. Now, it's difficult to overemphasize the significance of this conclusion. For many, it must have amounted to a direct assault on traditional fine arts practice, especially that of printmaking. After all, here was a printmaking process that, according to one observer, was even operated by women and, quote, seemed to require nothing but a steady hand, no artistical skill at all. Stephen Bann has demonstrated that, far from being merely manual and servile, reproductive printmaking was a lively and intellectually complex activity during the 19th century. Beginning in the 1830s, large and high-profile reproductive prints were commissioned from well-known engravers such as Luigi Calumata and Henriquel Dupont. These projects were often realized over the course of many years and attracted significant popular and critical attention. They were more often considered translations than copies. In some cases, the lavish engravings were even praised as improvements on the paintings they reproduced. And here on the left and in the middle, you see Dupont's print after drawing by Raphael, and you see the huge array of different mark-making processes being used on this work. And then on the far right, you see a similar detail from a reproduction from a relief surface by the Collard machine. And I think you can see the sort of mechanical nature of it. It is unsurprising, then, to find that the most vitriolic criticism of Collard's machine came from the well-known engraver Frederic Vo. In an article of 1834, he identified the metal engraving machine as the greatest threat to traditional printmaking and characterized the involvement of Delaroche and Henriquel Dupont as a betrayal of their profession. "Now here comes another enemy," he wrote, banner unfurled and with the attitude of a great man. "Its incisions are sure and its point never fails. This new genre, whose powerful hand comes to deliver the final blow to etching, has for its inventor Monsieur Collard, and for its hand a machine, for its proofreader Monsieur Henriquel Dupont, for its soul Delaroche. What a bizarre group! What guiding fury took hold of Delaroche? And how could Henriquel Dupont resign himself to reworking his skillful burin in the trenches dug by this comb? How could these two artists agree to encourage, one by his name, the other by his talent, this sad discovery? Don't they know that in the fine arts, mechanical engineering is like the head of Medusa, that it petrifies all those who regard it? What the committee praised as a virtuoso machine, a veritable Paganini of printmaking, Vo condemns as a cold and malevolent horror. The first impression caused by this genre of engraving is surprise, he argued. But this surprise soon ceases and becomes a sentiment of profound boredom. Everything is the same, monotonous and tight. Here, Vo attacks the style of the prints, or rather their lack of traditional artistic style. For him, they evince an industrial or mechanical appearance, one he associates with repetitiveness and the absence of individual expression. Now, in 1836, buoyed by the domestic success of the Trésor de Numismatique, Nolte travelled to London seeking to expand the publication's audience. After visiting the coin and medal collection of the British Museum, he was struck by the idea of producing a medallic history of England, using Collard's machine to reproduce the museum's collection of approximately 3,000 medals. Over the course of several meetings, the trustees of the museum examined the benefits and disadvantages of pursuing Nolte's project. When the trustees declined to pursue the project, Nolte took the extraordinary step of petitioning the British House of Commons to examine the proposal. Somewhat surprisingly, the House accepted the petition and referred it to the Select Committee on the British Museum, which held hearings on the subject between March 14 and July 12 of that year. Although they were intended to focus on Nolte's proposal and the possibility of government support for the project, the hearings were greatly complicated by the sudden emergence of one John Bate, an Englishman who had invented a similar machine to that of Collard. Bate claimed that the enterprise could be equally well executed by his own technology and cited the importance of the promotion of British industry. Consequently, the hearings became an inquiry into the relative merits of each machine. Throughout the hearings, an unprecedented level of attention was devoted to reproductive images. Publishers, sculptors, painters, archaeologists, and mechanics all gave testimony concerning the proper understanding of a visual copy. Rulers and compasses were deployed, diagrams were submitted in evidence, and a multitude of prints were compared with each other and with their original models. And the debate was not confined to the bureaucratic realm. It quickly spilled over into the public arena, where the controversy continued for months after the conclusion of the Select Committee inquiry. In numerous articles and editorials, the Athenaeum lent its support to Collard's machine, while the Mechanics magazine and the Literary Gazette threw their weight behind Bate. Nolte and Bate each supplied prints to the journals, which were distributed to their readers within issues. In this way, members of the public were encouraged to evaluate the machines and their products for themselves. At the Select Committee, the witnesses generally agreed that mechanically produced reproductions were more accurate than those made by hand. Sir Francis Chantrey, for example, stated that, quote, "If extreme accuracy is of importance, it is much more to be relied upon by machinery than by an engraving made from a drawing, which may have inaccuracies in parts which you can have no means of detecting." But was a machine to be relied upon? Edward Hawkins, keeper of antiquities at the British Museum, noted that, quote, "It may not give a full and entire representation of all that is there, but the defect is one of deficiency, not of inaccuracy, or rather, not misrepresentation." Hawkins was not merely quibbling with words. Like the other protagonists, he struggled to formulate a vocabulary for and a definition of truthful visual reproduction. Part of the problem, I would suggest, lay in the very subject matter of the prints. Medals were not simply artistic creations. They were also considered to be infallible historical documents, the so-called proof stones of history. The study of medals and coins, even as late as the 1830s, was described as a science. Did art and science have divergent notions of truth in visual representation? Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison have detailed the mid-19th century emergence of mechanical objectivity in scientific discourse, particularly in relation to visual illustration. By mechanical objectivity, they explain, we mean the insistent drive to repress the willful intervention of the artist-author and to put in its stead a set of procedures that would, as it were, move nature to the page through a strict protocol, if not automatically. This meant sometimes using an actual machine, sometimes a person's mechanized action, such as tracing. In the 1830s, the notion of mechanical objectivity was virtually non-existent. There are small ripples in the metal engraving debate that seem to suggest its possibility, but no clear arrival at the concept. Rather, the discourse coalesced around opposed but ill-defined concepts of artistic and mathematical accuracy. For his part, Nolte argued that, quote, "There is no imperfection in the machinery of the Collard machine, but there is merely a voluntary departure from that mathematical accuracy which we might have maintained had we thought fit to do so." The purpose of that departure, he claimed, was to produce a perspective view of the objects reproduced. In other words, the Collard process produced a reproduction that accounted for the existence of an embodied observer. As the medalist Benedetto Pastrucci testified, No distortion is produced by the French machine, but it is like looking at a colossal statue and making a drawing from the point where you stand. Nonetheless, Nolte was keen to demonstrate that Collard's machine could equally produce so-called mathematically correct copies. In the most spectacular print offered to the public as evidence of the machine's superiority, he offered 7 reproductions of a relief depicting Ariadne. 5 of the images are intentionally distorted, with the 6th described as mathematically accurate. Of course, without the original model, no reader could evaluate the truth of this claim either way, and instead, the apparent accuracy of the 6th image was cleverly suggested by comparison with the twisted, grimacing version surrounding it. In other words, the print only enforced the very manipulability of the machine. In the end, the Select Committee recommended against government funding for any project to reproduce objects from the British Museum, and Nolte returned to Paris empty-handed. 25 years later, Henri Delaborde updated the public on the apparently sad demise of Collard's technology. The Trésor de Numismatique, he wrote, was quickly terminated at the end of 1850. Since then, Collard's engraving machine has produced a banknote, railway stocks, business cards for shops, and finally disappeared. Like a meteor that dazzles and then fades into the night, he continued, this process was brilliant and marked its era. Why such success, and why its abandonment? Delaborde's answer, you might have guessed, was photography. One automated process had been, quite simply, supplanted by another. Yet photography never produced the same hallucinatory sense of the immediate presence of an object viewed at close quarters, which was precisely the mode of viewing required by medals. Collard's machine, it might be argued, better illustrated Walter Benjamin's well-known statement concerning modern visual culture. Day by day, he wrote, the need becomes greater to take possession of the object from the closest proximity in an image and in the reproduction of an image. In our age of 3D digital scanning and virtual reality technologies, Collard's process seems uncannily familiar. Thank you.